So I do believe there is something intrinsic going on there. And what makes people uncomfortable about this is the idea that it's unchangeable.
And here's the thing, what's your IQ, Nick? That'll be interesting to know. Because you're sitting here and you're making these arguments about, I mean, I do believe that it's unchangeable, but what's your IQ, Nick? What is your IQ? What have you done personally? What have you invented? What are your contributions other than spitting hate? What exactly do you do that is such a great contribution to the white race for power? When was the last time America had a large nation coming in and removing your leader militarily, throwing them in prison, and then putting their own leader in power? When was the last time that the UK had that? When name a single Western nation that has a military threat coming from outside telling it that it doesn't want its most progressive leaders in power. You don't have that. Okay, so you can't make the comparison or even talk about the African continent because you don't know anything about it.
If you knew what you were made of, then we would save the world.
So do you think it's literally, well, this is just what a black person is when they come out? Or do you think that post-welfare, LBJ, Great Society...
Well, this is what you've just argued. You've just argued that black people chose a culture. So that is, you are arguing that it's black nurturing. You're arguing that so you're arguing that it's black nature. You're arguing that black people make inherently bad choices in terms of the culture that they choose to uplift. So you're saying it's nature. That's not what he's saying. You're now arguing with him when he's supporting a point that you've said from the start.
Society, this is what black Americans have become, and I have a right to respond to that and say that as a white man, I don't want to live there.
Well, I think it's more nature than people would like to believe. There's this classic tension of, is it nature, is it nurture, is it cultural, or is it intrinsic, is it racial? And I've always been on the latter side of this among conservatives.
This is Candace now getting a taste of the rhetoric that she spewed. This is something that she's been saying inadvertently for a long time. Because she makes the nurture argument, but she always makes it on the basis that black people are making inherently bad choices and have made inherently bad choices from the start, and there's been no external force that has caused them to be in this position. This is what the ugly side of that is, Candace. The ugly side of that is that you got to get this white guy sitting opposite you saying, well, you guys are just stupid, aren't you? I mean, your brains don't quite work like the white people's do they?
Conservatives like to say it's all culture. Black America is the way it is because of hip-hop music and the Great Society and that kind of stuff.
And all of this hip-hop music, black people, when they were in control of hip-hop music, hip-hop was conscious. Hip-hop music only started being focused on gangster rap when white people took control of it. Because all of the major record labels, they decide who they're going to sign. It's got nothing to do with us. We don't choose the outcome. We don't choose the message. Okay? There are plenty of conscious rappers. There always have been. Plenty of conscious cultures. We used to even R&B music used to be centered around black love. Used to be centered around, two black characters falling in love or having some kind of, romantic misgiving or whatever it was. But it was centered around essentially black couples and the black family. And even that has been corroded and it's been removed. We're not in control of the messaging anymore. Okay, so you're blaming hip-hop culture on black people seems ridiculous when you know who the people who are in control of signing these major artists are. It's not black people. We might be the artists who are creating the music, but we are not in control of the message. We're not in control of what gets proliferated. So that seems, once again, a lack of knowing history has brought them to that conclusion.
And I think the uncomfortable reality is, a big part of it is intrinsic. One of the big arguments against the abolition of slavery in the 1860s is that, when Europeans colonized Africa, they hadn't discovered the wheel. There's no two-story buildings.
This is hilarious. I love the American perspective on these matters because they know so little about global history. It's hilarious. First of all, the last slave trade to be abolished was actually the Black Sea slave trade. Okay. From a British perspective, Britain abolished the trade in African slaves, or the transatlantic trade. They abolished that in 1833. And a lot of that abolition led to Britain being a maritime superpower. Okay, so this is a part of them essentially gaining power over North Africa, which used to be the maritime superpower of that time. North Africa actually had a very, very strong naval fleet. Now, as an aside, the point I'm making here is that 1833 was when the transatlantic trade was abolished in the West, we should say, so to speak. The last slave trade to be abolished was in 1867. That was the abolition of the Black Sea slave trade, which is the transport of Eastern Europeans, which is the longest standing slave trade, which had gone on for much longer. Okay, the Ottomans liked to trade in these Eastern Europeans. Okay, so white people were being transported via the Barbary slave trade, and Eastern Europeans were being transported via the Black Sea slave trade, right up until the mid 1860s. Okay, all across Europe. So a lot of the spread of white people in Europe was due to slavery. That's what a lot of people don't understand. White people being spread throughout Europe, moving into Asia, spread for a lot of the transportation of whiteness was a result of slavery. Okay, that's how white people ended up largely in North Africa. The large mixed / white presence that you get in modern day North Africa is almost entirely due to the Black Sea slave trade, with some later contribution from the Barbary slave trade. Okay, so he's sitting there and he's talking about, oh yeah, you know, the fear of releasing black people because, you know, black people hadn't invented the wheel or hadn't got 2-story buildings. That's just propaganda. You could actually find photos of 2-story buildings. Have a look at the Kano wall in northern Nigeria. Okay, these are only the photos that exist, by the way, because a lot of African buildings were deconstructed, but you can see the Kano walls, they're at least 6 stories. Okay, and when they say it's a building, it's a tower. So the Kano towers, you can see those are at least 6 stories. We've got photographs of those. Okay, we've got the Great Wall of Zimbabwe. That's at least, you know, 4 to 6 stories. There's many buildings throughout. The city of Benin, it's the street that ran through that city was said to be, the Ober's Palace was bigger than one of the biggest cities in Europe at the time. You can read about that. The Portuguese wrote about it extensively. So this idea that Africa was kind of like this undeveloped slum comes from ignorance, comes from not understanding or not knowing, and obviously being sold a degree of propaganda. So I can only give you partial blame, but also it's also just wanting to hear stuff that you want to hear. I'm talking about like the Africans hadn't invented the wheel. The oldest depictions of the wheel are found in the Sahara. Okay, not north of the Sahara, in the Sahara. Okay, that region of Africa. Yeah, that, and by the way, the Sahara is Africa. Okay, people like to speak about the Sahara as though, oh well, you know, we're talking about sub-Saharan, and the Sahara, the Sahel, that's always been regarded as being a part of Africa. Okay, it's filled with black people. Okay, you only find white people along the coastlines of northern Africa. Everything south of the coastlines essentially belongs to black Africa. Okay, and that's just a fact. All right, because Europeans just can't, and light-skinned people can't survive there. Okay, the Tuareg are black African, the Fula are black African, the Tebu are black African, the Haritin are black African, and they all exist in that, what you classify that northern region of Africa. So this is just what you call far right stupidity. Americans that have any concept of what the world looks like outside of America, and they like to simplify things. And the oldest depictions of the wheel can be found in the Sahara. Okay, so the wheel was absolutely present, and the only reason the wheel was perhaps used less is because there were more efficient forms of transportation, which you wouldn't know anything about.
There's no writing. There's no written language.
No writing, no written language. This one is hilarious. Okay, so Nick, are you aware that the language that's appearing on the screen now and the language that you write is Latin? And are you aware that the Latin script descends from Phoenician and Etruscan, which descend from ancient Egyptian hieratic script? Okay, the language that you are using right now, that script that you are using, that writing that you're using, is not even a European invention. Europeans have never in history, Western Europeans have never in history invented their own script. The invention of a script is a timely process that involves starting with pictographics and then evolving to ideographics and then evolve into phonemes. Okay, so this is what kind of like we see this process take place, where you start with pictorials and then you kind of move over to communicating ideas, and then you start using those ideas to vocalize utterances of a language. We see this process in the Far East with the Chinese scripts, which all descend from the same kind of ancestor. And we see this process in Africa on many occasions, not, by the way, just in Egypt. Okay, we see this process in the west of Africa and in Sibidi. And West Africa has many invented scripts, many hundreds of invented scripts. Okay, we see it East Africa, we see it in Southern Africa. Africa many times has created scripts. Europe has never created its own script. Okay, so by this way, when I say Europe, I mean Western Europe, not the part that was connected to Africa, the Mediterranean. Western Europe has never created its own script. They've only ever inherited and evolved scripts that they were given from Africa. So it's ironic that you make this writing systems argument, but you clearly haven't done the research, because nothing by the way that I'm saying is in any way, shape or form controversial. This is known fact amongst linguists. Ask them where your Latin script comes from, and ask them, you could even chat GPT, where has scripts been invented globally, and they'll tell you Africa, they will tell you Far East, and they will tell you perhaps the Americas as well, you could argue. Those are the known, and West Africa, those are the known invention points of scripts. You will get nothing for Western Europe, because Western Europeans have never invented their own script. So the idea, do you know that the city of Timbuktu, the university in the city of Timbuktu, produced more books in 1 year than the entirety of Europe produced up until the production of the printing press? So we're talking about manuscripts. Manuscripts are books that were written by hand. Okay. In one single year, the city of Timbuktu would produce probably in the region of about 500,000 books at its height of production. So this would have been around 1300 AD. It was producing around 12 to 1300 AD. The city of Timbuktu, the University of Sankore, was producing around 500,000 books annually. Up until the invention of the printing press in the mid to late 1400s, Western Europe had only produced, up until that point, 50,000 books in entirety of its existence. And you're going to sit there and talk about writing as though it was a Western invention. It's totally ahistorical. You don't know your history, and this is a great deal of the problem. And there's even arguments to be made, even when Western Europe did inherit the printing press, there is even an argument to be made that Western Europe is not the lily white civilization that you think it is.
Missionaries had to go to Africa in the last century and invent it for the African people, because there's no recorded history. They didn't have writing.
Well, that's just a load of bollocks. There's writing all over Africa. Okay, was a lot of writing destroyed? Yes, because we had a system there was a process called Operation Legacy, which essentially was created to deconstruct Africa, where they did a lot of destruction of any buildings that were more than 2 stories, hence why they were able to proliferate this lie that Africans didn't have any buildings above 2 stories, because you destroyed everything that was bigger than 2 stories, and also to burn and destroy other writing. Now that's being well documented now, that pretty much all of Africa's writing was burnt by the colonial forces, because they were trying to essentially hide Africa's capabilities to justify their position in the slave trade, amongst other things. But I wouldn't expect you to know that, because that takes someone who's relatively well read in history to have that understanding. Now, what's funny here is Candace's total inability to be able to verbalize or even know. I wouldn't expect her to know even a fraction of this, because she's spent all of her time grifting to placate the white race. That's why she's unable to make any of these arguments.
So Egypt is not in Africa?
Well, Egypt is a different race.
And then she's made the argument, well, Egypt's not in Africa. He said Egypt is a different race. So it's like, well, no, Egypt is a different race. Egyptians were African, okay? And Egypt was always placed alongside the Ethiopians, okay? If you look at anybody historically, from Herodotus to Diodorus to any of the contemporary people who were there when there was the ancient Egyptian civilization, even biblically, they'll talk about Egypt and Kush, Egypt and Ethiopia. Egypt, so when we're talking about Kush and Ethiopia, we're talking about Central Africa. The people you would classify as black or sub-Saharan African, they were classified as one. They had one culture, they had one ancestor, Ham. Okay, so they both descended from, that single ancestor. It was very clearly acknowledged lineage in the Bible. You're dealing with the same race, black-skinned, woolly-haired people. That's the words of Herodotus, by the way. Ancient Egyptians were the same as other Africans historically. Okay, and even if you remove them, that still leaves you with the kingdom of Kush, the kingdom of Meroe. These are black African kingdoms. These are sub-Saharan kingdoms. And yes, they did have writing. They had it thousands of years before Europe of any kind, even the Mediterranean, had writing. That is a fact.
The Egyptians were not black.
Okay, but you said when they went to Africa, so I just want to...
The interior.
Do you think the Egyptians were white, by the way? I mean, he won't argue that. Do you think the Egyptians were white? Do you think the ancient Egyptians looked like you?
Of Africa in the late 19th century. Scrambled
Okay,
for
so we're now knocking Egypt out of Africa.
Well, Egypt is part of northern Africa. So
And this is the problem now. See, Candace Owens, you're trying to argue the Egyptians were Africans argument. It's going to fall on deaf ears. You've cultivated your audience. You're going to have no support in your comments, no support from your community with that kind of argument. Okay, because for your audience, that's a Hotep argument. That's a Afrocentric or blackwashing argument, because you've cultivated an audience of trolls and people who are historically illiterate. So you're not able to support this now. So now you're just going to sound like you're really coping. This is when you're losing this argument bigly.
Right, so it's Africa. You said Africa, so I'm not trying to get a gotcha. I'm just responding. You're saying Africa.
Sure. Yeah.
It's in Africa. It's Egypt. It's kind of ridiculous that there was no written language. So I'm just trying to get you to
Sure.
You know,
Egyptians are not Africans.
If I'm not pushing back, the internet will. So you know.
Egyptians are not racial Africans.
Egyptians are not Africans. They're not racial Africans. What Egyptians are in Africa, their civilization was started in Africa. You can see the origins of their civilization being the land of Punt, Niger, Great Lakes region of Africa, and or Somalia, depending on which argument you're going to take, but still firmly within Africa. Their culture was African. Nothing that took place in Egypt was imported from elsewhere. You could maybe say the camel came towards the kind of like towards the New to Late Kingdom. They inherited the camel, but even that doesn't even appear on hieroglyphs. So it wasn't really that much of an important importation. Apart from that, everything that Egypt gave to the world, exported to the world, came from Egypt, and they were fully African. In every sense of the word, Egyptians are Africans. So this is once again stupidity.
When I say African, I'm saying sub-Saharan African.
Sub-Saharan, okay.
Black people because it is a different...
Well, sub-Saharan, this is where she should have pushed back, okay, and said, well, what does sub-Saharan mean? And why are you arguing sub-Saharan? Why is that important? Because black people exist within the Sahara and above the Sahara, and always have done. They exist there to this very day. You can't deny their existence because you want to make this kind of like sub-Saharan black, everybody above sub-Saharan white argument. You can't make that argument. Only someone who's never been to the continent can make the argument. There are still black people in Egypt, black native Egyptians to this day. And in spite of the massive genocide that took place in Libya, that has turned Libya from a place that... Two genocides, by the way. First genocide by Mussolini in the just after, I think, World War One, and the second genocide is the one that just took place by President Obama in Libya, have changed Libya now, where it's got a large Arab population. Before those two genocides, Libya looked a lot like Sudan, modern day Sudan, had a massive black population. And what we've seen is the continual culling of that black population to the point now where it's very minimal, and it's really sad and unfortunate to see these genocides take place in our lifetime. But this is what has taken place. But you can't argue that these black people did not exist or do not exist, because they do. And your attempt to write them out of history is not going to work. They still exist, okay?
Race. In sub-Saharan Africa, and Europeans did not penetrate that until the late 19th century, they didn't have any of this. To the extent that you have infrastructure in Africa, it's from the Muslims in the Sahel.
And this is ridiculous now. Okay, so now he's making the argument that religion denotes race. Okay, so he said the extent of technology came from... First of all, that's a false, but let's argue that that's true. Okay, the Sahel region. When he's talking about the Sahel region, we're talking about Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, you know, the African Sahelian alliance that's taking place now, Sudan. Okay, these are fully black nations, 100% black populations. But because their religion of choice is Islam, it makes them not black. So you could argue by the same merit that every single white Christian achievement that's taken place. So every single achievement that was done, the Crusades were done under the banner of Christianity. Christianity is a Middle Eastern, some would argue African religion in its origin. Okay, it's a religion fully established in the Arabian Peninsula, round the Sinai. We're talking about very close to the border of Africa, and some people would argue many of those actual events actually took place in Africa, but I'm not even going to go into that conspiracy theory. So let's say it's an Arabian Peninsula religion, okay, near the equator. We're talking equatorial, almost equatorial region of the world, right next to Africa, Southwestern Asian religion. That's where Christianity comes from. That's the origins of that belief system. So because the origins of that belief system are in that region now, we can't give anybody who said they were Christian any credit. We can't say, oh well, then the achievements of the white people haven't done anything because they did everything under the banner of Christianity and they spoke Latin. By the way, Latin. I like you to look on a map where Rome is. Okay. And we've already explained that the Latin script was inherited from Egypt. So now there's no credit that can be given to white people for anything because they're practicing the Afro-Asiatic religion and they're using Afro-Asiatic script. So therefore, we can't give white people any credit for anything because that's the argument he's making here. Oh, well, the Muslims, all of the credit goes to the black Muslims. Okay, people who had accepted Islam as their religion but remained black.
In the Maghreb, in northern Africa, where the Arabs colonized, and then you had, Carthage and Egypt. You had ancient.
And the Arabs didn't colonize, actually. African Muslims were responsible for the spread of Islam throughout Africa. And actually, if you read the records of Kingdom of Mali, Kingdom of Songhai, they were actually more responsible for the export of Islam than its import, actually. They actually enriched the surrounding nations. We all know about the trip that Mansa Musa took to Egypt and essentially crashed their economy because he brought so much gold. Okay, these were the Muslims that Africa produced that went around enriching the rest of the world. So this idea of like Muslims colonizing and bringing Africans under the thumb, it's absolutely ridiculous. Africans were responsible for the proliferation of Islam largely. Okay, in its early years, it was North Africa far more than the Arabian Peninsula was the hub of Islam itself. So make that argument correctly.
Civilizations, but sub-Saharan Africa, they didn't have that. You take these people out of the.
And by the way, the Sahel is sub-Saharan Africa. So he just argued that sub-Saharan Africa didn't have something, but he's used to support his argument Sahelian states, which are sub-Saharan Africa. So he doesn't even know basic geography. This is the problem with people like this.
That land and put them here, and they're enslaved people. You let them free in a modern, liberal republic, they're not going to succeed. It's not going to go well for them. And that was one of the arguments against abolition. People said if you free them without any assimilation, without any kind of process for them to be acclimated, they're going to die. And that's exactly what happened.
And this is hilarious now. So now he's making this argument that basically they freed the slaves who were these like rampant Africans, and they were like, and then they all kind of just like, they died out. Yeah, that's great if you don't bother reading at all American history. But if you'll actually read American history, you'll find that the slaves after emancipation, in spite of, by the way, there's a long history about what happened in the Confederate States and the black people who used to be very powerful losing their right to buy land and losing their property and stuff like that. I'm not going to talk about that. Even in spite of that, and black people not being paid the reparations that they were due, the 40 acres, because anyway, I'm not going to go into why they should have been given all of that. Even that aside, they still managed to successfully build multiple communities. Black people built. You have to understand, at the end of slavery and emancipation, black people held all of the skills. They held all of the construction skills. They held all of the capabilities. And all of these towns and cities that you look around America, it looks so beautiful, were built by black people. Okay, not for white people either, and not necessarily under slavery. But what white people would do periodically is invade, is steal, is create race riots, and then they would move into the towns and the cities that black people had built. This happened over and over again. I speak about a book called Sundown Towns by James Lavin, which talks about this in great detail. It talks about 10,000 events, 10,000 violent events at least in America, where black people had created either towns, cities, or had bought up certain parts and areas of certain towns and cities, and then they would be invaded by jealous, angry, poor white people like Nick Fuentes, who believed it was their right to own those things. And this is what has moved America to the state where it is now. It's not been through merit. When people talk about lynchings, and I speak about this all the time, when we talk about lynchings in America, it wasn't just the case of them finding a random black guy to lynch. They would find someone who had land. They would find someone who had ownership. They would find someone who had their own property. So it wasn't just, they weren't going after random people. Lynchings were strategic moves by the KKK to acquire land without paying for it and to move poor white people into it. There's a film about the Osage County, but that's more centered or focused towards the Native American community. It's got Leonardo DiCaprio in it. If you can watch that film, please do. I'll put the name on the screen now, 'cause I can't think of it. So this film demonstrates exactly how white people essentially in America, by the way, I'm not talking about white people in general, white people in America had just made a habit of when people acquire wealth who are not white and they want it, they will find a way of acquiring it. They will infiltrate those communities through violence and displace that wealth and make sure that it falls into their hands. They've done it over and over again. They did it in Hawaii. They did it all over America, and they did it to freed, emancipated blacks who created multiple cities and towns. So Nick thinking that America is where it is through some kind of process of meritocracy and then releasing the slaves and the slaves be like, oh God, we don't know what to do. It's a myth. It's not reality at all. Black people have never needed the assistance of white people. Okay, I would say integration benefited whites, but they only did it after they had fully gone around America, deconstructing, stealing, moving into, or flooding, or making parks over areas that black people had created, over economic hubs that black people had created that were independent of them. America has never been divorced from using violence to take what doesn't belong to them. That is a fact.
Many of the bottom 10% of the lowest IQ Africans just died off for generations, and it had a, pardon the expression, but it had a eugenic effect.
So wait a second, where does he get this from? This is hilarious. So he's talking about, the bottom 10% or so, what happened? So after emancipation, they did global IQ tests, and after those kind of universal IQ tests took place, they were able to identify that the bottom 10% of black people just died off in America. They just, what are you talking about? What on earth are you talking about? You've got no empirical evidence to support this. This is just made up crap that you're just spewing out. This never happened.
Because over time, if the weakest are dying off, that's one argument for why.
I think that's actually what happened in white America, and this is once again him projecting. Do you realize that the reason Nick exists is because after emancipation and the success of black people at building up towns and cities, the first thing that the American government decided they need to do was to increase the number of whites, which is what opened the borders and opened the doors to white immigration from Europe. Because they realized in terms of their racial policies, they were at a disadvantage to the black population, who just essentially had greater numbers. And a part of galvanizing this was to import or allow large amounts of immigration to take place from Western Europe directly into America, which is when they started opening the doors to people like these Italians and these Irish and this, that and the other. This was to get the count of whites up in America. That's why those policies actually took place, and that's why Nick Fuentes even exists. Okay, this is not going too far back. This is 3 or 4 generations back with them importing these different groups. This is why you had the big, hey, Italian American communities formed. This was a very deliberate strategy to up the number of whites to be able to essentially compete with what they saw as a nation that they were going to lose to the blacks. This is more historical fact that they're missing out on.
Blacks in America have a standard deviation higher IQ than the blacks in sub-Saharan Africa. So,
And that's not true. Again, he said the blacks in America have a standard deviation higher IQ. Where is he getting these statistics from? But IQ only measures a small type of intelligence, and people like to overrate the importance of IQ. But what good is it, for instance, being a nation with massively high IQ and no creative ability? How many high IQ nations produce nothing in terms of inventions for the rest of the world? Innovations, creativity, nothing. How many? Because I could name loads, and I don't want to for the sake of being too controversial, but there are many nations that just manufacture goods that have already been invented and don't create or don't invent anything, have an inability to be creative. So there are many ways, and it even talk about emotional quota, EQ level, and many people argue that that's more important. I'm not making an argument. The argument that I'm making is that this is a very simplistic argument that suits a Western education system and a westernized mind, okay? But it's not necessarily the type of education system that other people correspond with, or other groups or other cultures correspond with. But either which way, he doesn't even have the empirical data to back this, so he doesn't even need too much of a rebuttal in that regard.
So I do believe there is something intrinsic going on there. And what makes people uncomfortable about this is the idea that it's unchangeable.
And here's the thing. What's your IQ, Nick? That'll be interesting to know. Because you're sitting here and you're making these arguments about, I do believe that it's unchangeable. But what's your IQ, Nick? What is your IQ? What have you done personally? What have you invented? What are your contributions other than spitting hate? What exactly do you do that is such a great contribution to the white race? And by the way, white race is something that you'll flip-flop between, because you'll say that you're Mexican when it suits you.
Supremacist? I'm not white. I'm Mexican. I'm also Fuentes. I know. I kind of white.
So this is the funny thing.
There's something about, and this is why I'm a Catholic, we do have an inherent desire for universalism.
Catholic, by the way. This is why I'm a Catholic. Catholic being a Romo-Italian derivation of an Afro-Asiatic religion, being clear. Yeah? Just to be clear about what a Catholic is.
We do believe that there's a common humanity and a common human community and all of that. We hate the idea that we're born a certain way and we can never change, and that's just the way it is. And we even think about this in terms of, you
don't hate the idea, you love that idea because your ideology relies on the idea being true. So let's not, be coy here. Be honest to your audience. You don't need to lie to put this false view across. I just hate the idea that we're just inherently smarter than you. No, you really hope and want for it to be true, because then it explains so much in your personal life. Then it makes you feel so much more secure in the tiny little unattractive man that you are.
Become not so popular these days to tell children you can be whatever you want to be, because we know that's not the case. Some people are tall, some people are short, some people are smart, some dumb, some
and you fall into the latter of both of those categories that you've just put forward, which is hilarious.
Ugly, some handsome.
Oh, there you go, 3. no, sorry, you're formal for that one. So being ugly, short and dumb, I know it's rough, but at least you're white. At least you're white, Nick.
That's why, by the way, incel dumb is a big part of this also.
So you believe these are immutable characteristics that are assigned at birth?
I think that, yes.
For the most part.
Things like race, all those attributes are immutable and unchangeable, and
but they have changed, just factually speaking, they have changed.
They change over time, over the generations.
Okay, so then you don't think it's immutable, because if this was an immutable
individual person.
Okay, so you're saying that if you are born at this space and time as a black person in America, here is the cards that you're dealt with, and you can't change that over time.
Something like IQ.
Say, to be clear, the average black American is immensely better looking, immensely taller, has more gravitas, and is probably smarter than Nick Fuentes. And this is what you have to understand. A lot of this is centered on. He needs to present this perspective, this view of black people being something to make himself feel better. In terms of the spectrum of humanity, he really is on the reject end. I don't know if you ever watched a movie growing up called Twin, which had Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito as twins, and they kind of like, when they split the egg, all of the good genes went into Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the waste genes is what produced Danny DeVito. Nick Fuentes, in terms of humanity, the human spectrum, he's been shit upon. I guarantee you that his is no bigger than that. I guarantee you that he's already been open about the fact that he's never had a girlfriend. He thinks sex is gross, and he thinks having sex with women is gay. It's a bit gay to have sex with women. I mean, is this your king?
Is this what you left me for?
He's sitting here with all the chest in the world talking about the superior white race. Well, you don't have any of that superiority. That's just a fact.
I believe they can actually.
Yeah.
But
So does that kind of debunk your?
no, because it's rare that happens. But IQ is a heritable trait, so it's unlikely that happens.
Okay.
And do you not recognize that there's group differences in IQ? Or?
I think that there's group differences, but
Okay.
I wouldn't say, and the reason why I'm pushing back.
And the thing is, there isn't. People make this argument about there being group differences in IQ. It's like, what groups are you doing? Like, if you get the average IQ for Nigeria, which groups did you include in that? Because Nigeria is not like a ethno state, you know. It's not like the United States of America where all people say, oh, we're just white people, this, that, and the other. It's like, no, we got hundreds of ethnic groups from hundreds of different backgrounds and hundreds of languages. So where was you concentrated when you did this? Did you deliberately only include one group or another group? Did you overrepresent it in one group? Because to be honest with you, if you was going to include all of the ethnicities in Africa, so in Nigeria, you would need a sample size of at least 100,000. And I know there's no IQ test or that's ever done a sample size that large before, but you'd need one at least that large, because then at least that would then give you the ability to have like a couple hundred people from each ethnic group. Otherwise, you'd be looking at maybe one or two per ethnic group. You know, average sample size for these kind of IQ tests is probably in the region of about, I don't know, 1,000 to 2,000 per ethnic group to get kind of like an idea of what the IQ is. And it's ridiculous. It's like it's so easy to skew these tests, and even then you have to, there's so much in IQ tests, for instance, because they do these IQ tests in the UK now for the kids that are very young. They call it non-verbal reasoning, and it's essentially the same thing. But a lot of people don't realize there's so much of a cultural influence on the way these tests work, the way the questions are answered, the way logic, what's classified as being logic, but the way logic is executed is very ethnocentric. Okay, if you're gonna make for instance, if you're gonna do a logic test that's based on which shape fits in here, everyone goes, oh well, that's easy, you know, it doesn't matter which culture you're from, you should be able to figure that out. It's like, well, no, it depends where you grew up. Because if you grew up in a culture where all of the kids' toys have these sort and slot things, okay, and they sell Rubik's cubes, and they have all of these, you grew up and, you know, your mum gave you a tray of, you know, stars and shapes and stuff like that, which you used to always puzzle together, this, that and the other, then you've developed that part of your brain. If you develop in a part of the world where kids' toys look very, very different, maybe they just gave you a doll, or they gave you some sticks and knives for you to kind of like etch stuff yourselves, or this, that and the other, and you used to make your own dolls, and you've never really interacted with shapes, which, by the way, shapes make a big part of IQ tests. If you've never really interacted with shapes before, you're now having to trigger and train a part of your brain that is very developed in different groups. Okay, it's the same thing with, like, there's so many things in these IQ tests which are supposed to be kind of like, you know, these are generic measures of intelligence. There's so many things that are culturally influenced, and people do not realize it. Okay, and that's just a very basic thing that anybody should be able to observe. I simply observed it by looking at these tests. We're like, well, actually, these are all cultural. These are all things that it depends where you grow up and how much you've interacted with them, and depends the style of learning that you like, that is going to influence the outcome of these things. So it's just one of those things that I wouldn't expect a a Nick Fuentes or any of his groyper idiot audience to kind of like understand something that basic, but it is a massive contributing factor to the outcome of these studies.
On this is because those perspectives that you hold, Thomas Sowell did a really good job debunking that. And I think the book is called Intellectuals and Race, and he opened up and makes...
Oh dear, it's using Thomas Sowell to debunk Nick Fuentes. It's not a good look. Oh dear.
A very sound argument that these characteristics are not immutable, and that it can be your environment, and he kind of goes back and discusses who had the highest IQ and who now has the highest IQ, and so I just disagree.
So you're making the argument she's making here is that it's still a cultural flaw. It's still kind of like it's a cultural flaw, but it can change. All we got to do is stop wanting that culture out, but it's got nothing to do with systemic. It's, for instance, taking that ahistorical approach that she's just taken. I gave the example earlier of the Congo. Okay, that's that the argument there is that the Congo can work itself out of poverty. If those Congolese people, it's their fault. If the Congolese people just rise up, they wouldn't be in this position. The Congolese people voted in a president that could have saved them in the 1960s. He was murdered violently. They put in place a puppet leader, and since then they have basically been under the thumb of Rwandan and Ugandan troops who act as proxy militants for Western organizations to destabilize, to stop the Congo from building any kind of military or domestic resistance against their kind of essentially their invasion. And what do you expect the people to do in that situation? What do you expect them to do? What does the average Congolese person do to correct that? How is that corrected? This is a job for the international community to resolve, for sanctions to be put on certain nations to stop them from exploiting in the way that they are. But they're not going to do that because the CIA trained Kagame, and I could go on and on and on, but I'm not going to go into that into too much detail. But the bottom line is there is nothing that the Congolese people can do to improve their position in terms of being able to compete for resources. Yes, Congolese individuals do, once again, the best that they can. Many are very upwardly mobile and will find a way of working themselves into better circumstances. I know many successful Congolese people, but in terms of their nation's broader macroeconomic picture and the exploitation of resources, that can never be put on the Congolese people. It's got nothing to do with the average Congolese person, how that nation's being exploited, and there's nothing they can do unless you can think of a way that they can fund the military and go to war with the surrounding nations which are being used as proxies to invade them. There's nothing they can do. This is the kind of apolitical, ahistorical, fact-based approach or discussion that's taken place between Candace Owens and this guy here. They don't know anything about the world in which they live in, and yet they're seen as authorities. Is a joke.
Agree with you fundamentally, but you have a right to have that perspective.
So you don't think that there's group differences on average between the races?
I think, just to be clear, I think there would be group differences if you took it, like we were talking about, an American versus somebody who graduates college in Europe. There'd be tremendous differences.
Not tremendous, but yeah, there would be slight differences, but you don't think that racially there's differences between races?
I think, yeah.
I see, he has to cling on to his race thing. So the point that she made there is that the average American isn't as smart as the average European. Yes, it's true, okay? And he's like, well, no, let's focus on the races. But what he won't want to do is focus on, actually, well then, if it's a race thing, let's take a group within, let's take America, for instance, as our sample pot, and let's focus on a specific group within America. Let's take the average IQ of Nigerian Americans and compare that to white Americans, and I guarantee you Nigerian Americans are probably exponentially higher than white Americans. Okay, now I'm not saying that's the correct thing to do, because I am well aware of the fact that the Nigerians that end up in America are of a higher socioeconomic class. Okay, they've probably had access to more opportunity, and they've also gone there with the intention. So that in terms of their upward mobility, they are a certain class of Nigerian that you've managed to, or that have managed to make their way to the Americas, which is why they are the most educated group, single most educated group in America. There is a reason that feeds into that. But if I took the approach that you're taking here, is that, oh, all of that backstory doesn't matter. I could just go, well, Nigerians are just smarter than Americans. Do you understand? Like, that's a very easy, you can do that in any nation and get the same outcome. As a black person, I can do that in any nation and find a target group and get the outcome that I desire. This is why what he's doing here is so disingenuous, because he would not accept that argument. If I was to say, he'd be, no, let's just focus on black. I was like, no, why would I do that? You've already agreed that these two groups have got different, origins and different different ethnic origins. And we've also agreed that although IQ is heritable, it does change over time. So therefore we have to regard, for instance, black Americans as separate from black Nigerians. So let's take black Nigerians as our sample set and white Americans to do the comparison there. You wouldn't do that because it would not favor your argument, which is why it needs to be abandoned, this whole racial argument. Most people who have got any level of intelligence know that the link between socioeconomic status and IQ or intelligence quota, they are irrefutable. Okay, it's irrefutable. People who are in situations of duress do not get the same opportunity to develop certain neurological pathways, thought processes outside of their immediate needs. It goes to a very basic argument of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Until you've secured your physical needs, until you've secured your security needs, which is at the very, very base, you can't then progress onto your social needs and then your ego needs and then your self-actualization. You won't even get up to that anywhere up near the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs until you have those physical and security needs met. And when they're not being met, you don't develop the neurological pathways which allow you to explore your mind and develop your brain in a certain way. That's just the fact. So this is a simplistic argument, and it's being made because he feels insecure about who he is as an individual.
Huge differences culturally. So going to your point of saying, I don't want to live in a black neighborhood, well, neither does LeBron James when he gets money, right? And there's a reason for that, because there is something that's happening culturally in black America that's going on for...
No, and this is where she's fallen apart there. LeBron James absolutely would want to live in a black neighborhood. And this is where you've fallen and you've failed. It's got nothing to do with the race of the neighborhood. LeBron James wants to live in a neighborhood that is comparative to his income. He wants to live in a socio-economically representative neighborhood. So he wants to live amongst people who are peers in terms of his earning power. If there was a black neighborhood that existed that had peers in terms of his earning power, he would absolutely live there. He would have no problem. No black person in the world would have a problem living amongst other blacks or other black people who had their same earning potential, because we know for a fact that we wouldn't have the problem of crime that you have in crime-ridden areas which are always poor. So the issue is socioeconomics, not race. People aren't trying to escape black neighborhoods. Black people aren't trying to get away from black people. They're trying to get away from poverty, the same way rich whites don't go to move into poor white neighborhoods. You don't get rich whites running to buy houses in the Ozark, okay, or running to buy houses in some hillbilly hick town somewhere where all the residents are cousins. Yeah. They don't want to live there. They want to live, rich whites and rich blacks both want to live in Beverly Hills, both want to live in, the fancy parts of LA or whatever it is. They all want to live there. Everybody with money wants to live in the nice areas. Same way rich blacks and rich whites in the UK, they want to live in Hertfordshire, they want to live in central London, they want to live in nice parts. They don't want to live in friggin' poor, broke down Liverpool. no disrespect to my Liverpoolians out there. No one's got to get their money and then move into our council estate, you know what I mean? No one's got to get their millions and then move into, the middle of Peckham. Yeah, this is actually, no, Peckham has nice parts, but you know the point I'm making here, okay? People move to where it socio-economically makes sense for the amount of money that they're making, okay? And this is where Candace moved, LeBron doesn't want to live in a black neighborhood either. It's like, no, you've just shot yourself in the foot. You don't know how to navigate this discussion.
For a very long time, but that thing, I would argue, didn't exist in...
What about in Africa and Haiti? I mean, they're killing and eating each other in Africa and Haiti, everywhere where they are.
Africa and Haiti. So he's got to summarize a whole continent. And once again, I've made a lot of discussion about Africa to this point. I don't need to go into it. But Haiti, we know that Haiti has been very destabilized. France has never forgiven it for essentially getting its arse whooped by the Haitians. And America has been a proxy for the complete and utter destabilization and destruction of Haiti. For years, the UN have occupied Haiti with unrelenting violence, and a lot of people think that UN forces are good. UN forces have been murdering with impunity in Haiti for 40 years, and they go in there periodically and destabilize that nation. It's very, very difficult for Haitians to find any autonomy within that nation. So it's essentially just been settled by America. The US will destabilize everyone they can. Let's not be idiots, and let's look at the history of the USA, which has been constant wars, constant military aggression towards different parts of the world, be it South America, be it Middle East, be it Asia, be it the Caribbean island. Like, it's just constant war, constant war, invasion, destabilization. That's what America does. No one's making this up. This isn't a conspiracy theory. We have the receipts, we have the track record of what you do to nations that aren't serving your best interests. So trying to look at Haiti and then isolate as a failure in black leadership and discounting the fact that America has been a constant military presence there is absolutely ridiculous.
We have these problems.
Yeah, I'd like to look into, and I'm pleading ignorant, but I've heard some things about what happened in Haiti and what the Clinton Foundation did there. So I think I'd have to look more into the history of Haiti to be able to push back on that at all. I don't think I agree with that.
What about?
And it's too late. So you see, you don't think you agree, but it's too late because you're the one who's arm nicked to make these stupid arguments. And you're also not willing to essentially just relent on your false statements that you've made about black problems being linked exclusively to the acceptance of, a poor culture. There's a poor cultural inheritance in black America. That's where he's basically saying the same thing that you've already put out there.
Not all of Africa, then. There's not one country in sub-Saharan Africa that's successful. Not one. They're all least developed countries. They're all failed states.
This kind of reminds me, and we could kind of flesh out this conversation together, and
I'm not going to go into, but I've already given the Congolese example, and I could give that example across Africa. There's always been a ongoing destabilizing presence, military presence, and violent one, by the way, that will kill our leaders. We in Africa are very aware of this fact. Okay, does this excuse every single poor African leader or poor decision that's been made? Absolutely not, but certainly the groundwork has been there.
Not perhaps ready to have it fully, but I do remember going back to Dave Smith where he was conceding a point on, well, all of these other Middle Eastern countries, no, you wouldn't want to live there, you want to live in Israel. In my mind, I'm going, well, because you just keep bombing the crap out of them if they ever try to get ahead. I remember watching this clip of him saying that, going, why don't these countries get ahead? And kind of going back in my mind to the Gaddafi speech where he keeps speaking essentially about, here's what we got to do in Libya to get ahead, here's what we're going to do with the dollar, and we're going to be progressive and this and that. And they killed him. And then what happened to those Libyan refugees? I believe they're now pouring into, just like he said was going to happen, that they were now pouring into the European continent, and Europeans are complaining, who are these people? And so the question is, are we allowing, because I'm like, Africa's a pretty rich country. Like, why aren't
Africa's a pretty rich country. I was about to say, she made a good point there with Libya, and I was interested to see his response, but he said Africa's a pretty rich country. I know she probably meant to say continent, and it's more than pretty rich. It's, it essentially holds the most vital minerals that are required for basically everything to operate in this world. And not only that, it has a incredibly intelligent populace.
Americans controlling the diamond trade. Who's taking all of the diamonds so that they can't control the diamond trade? And how long have these people been doing that? Being essentially culture vultures. That's kind of...
It's not culture vulture. That's been an economic exploiter. That's been a domestic destabilizing effect. Okay, and we obviously know that the white South Africans are the ones who've benefited almost exclusively from the South African diamond trade. Mugabe did a very good job correcting the diamond trade in Zimbabwe, but we're now seeing since his death a lot of the work that he's been doing there has been reversing, unfortunately. So there's work to be done on the African continent because there's a constant belligerent military force. France has invaded Africa in some way, shape or form multiple times, dozens of times in the past couple of decades. France continues its military presence there, and losing this that Sahelian alliance, they're not taking the line down. They continue to try to assert themselves militarily in the region. For instance, President Ouattara of the Ivory Coast, he's a French plant. Everyone knows that. That's a black Frenchman essentially who was placed there by France. They got rid of Laurent Gbagbo, who was the democratically elected leader, because he wanted to make progressive steps once again and move Ivory Coast forward. He was one of these leaders that used to play ball and then decided, no, I'm not going to play ball anymore, I'm going to progress my country. And when he did, France literally invaded the Ivory Coast, but you never heard about it because it happened during the invasion of Libya. They literally sent troops. I think they killed 4,000 Ivorians during the time when and these were innocent protesters, most of them, when they were removing Laurent Gbagbo, who they put in prison. Imprisoned him, and they put in Ouattara, who has a white wife. This is what the West do. And then you'll turn around and go, oh, well, look at Ivory Coast, why can't they sort themselves out? What Western nation has to deal with a superpower? When was the last time America had a large nation coming in and removing your leader militarily, throwing them in prison, and then putting their own leader in power? When was the last time that the UK had that? When name a single Western nation that has a military threat coming from outside telling it that it doesn't want its most progressive leaders in power. You don't have that. Okay, so you can't make the comparison or even talk about the African continent because you don't know anything about it.
Of the journey that I've been on now in terms of really trying to go back and look into history to see what's happened. And I never trust myself when I have a perspective now, because I realize how much of my opinions and beliefs were shaped by the public school system. And so I don't think you're right. I think that there has been a very sophisticated effort to, just like you would say now, in terms of people that are intentionally attacking Anglo-Saxons. I'm just learning about that there were these books that were written to, we must genocide the Anglo-Saxons, that were going on for a lot longer than I realized. History didn't begin with World War II, but I think it would take a lot of time to kind of unpack that.
Yeah.
Like, are we stopping people from getting ahead just because, I don't know.
That just sounds, I mean.
So let's say this is her coming to a point of enlightenment. And I respect the fact that everybody comes to this point of enlightenment over a certain course of time. But I don't know how genuine or how long it's going to go on for with someone like Candace, who's invested so much in her grift, whether or not she'd even be willing to be totally transparent with the things she's learned, given that her audience that she's fostered is an audience of racists. This is the problem. You end up with the audience that you've garnered, okay? And you can't suddenly U-turn on them, ideologically speaking. So you have to maintain in your grift. She's created a audience of racists, and as much as she's trying to come to this position of enlightenment, they are not going to be there for it. They're not going to be patient with it. You haven't fostered that audience. I can do that because I don't have the audience that you have. You can't do that because you've fostered your audience on hate, ignorance, and using you as a reaffirmation for their dislike, their unwarranted dislike of black people.
In being honest with you, that just sounds to me like a left-wing argument when they say, why don't these countries get ahead? Colonialism, you're a colonizer. It's like, okay, but when we got there, they had no development.
Okay, why don't Mexico get ahead, Nick? What's going on? Like, you're literally right next door to America. Why don't Mexico get ahead? Why do Mexican gang keep killing each other and you have so much violence? And what's going on with Mexico? Why are you not talking about them?
We got to Africa, they had no technological development.
So you think that even if we weren't...
And that's not even true when you talk about this one thing, but I don't expect him to know any better. In his mind, Africa was this kind of like undeveloped mud hut. And to be honest with you, a lot of Africans, a lot of black people globally don't know about Africa. Even Africans themselves, a lot of them don't know about Africa because they've been so miseducated. But if you was to actually, take the time to do the research, you realize that Africa is the place of most human firsts. Most human firsts came from Africa. Okay, some of the most elaborate artworks in the world came out of the African continent. Some of the best human technologies came out of the African continent, and people just aren't aware of this because they don't bother doing the reading. And it's presentism, basically colonialism and imperialism has placed Africa essentially under the thumb of the belligerent Western white male. Okay, that's essentially what's happened with Africa. So it's understandable in many ways that people have this perspective, but it doesn't make it correct.
At war. And sure, you could say that you think that's a leftist argument. I really push back on that because I've learned so much about just like recent history that I didn't know. But you think that the Middle East, like if we had done nothing in terms of the Middle East, that they would just be savages and just be like, you know, America didn't do anything it doesn't set anything backwards. They're just like bombing a place.
Yeah, kind of. I think that we did set them back because when they don't have political order, it prevents.
Well, there you go. And this is the thing. So this is why you can't debate with someone as stupid as this, because it doesn't even take a rocket scientist. We could take Libya as an example of an African nation with a large kind of like Middle Eastern cultural presence. So let's call it an African nation with a large Middle Eastern cultural presence. Under Gaddafi, had the world's most advanced underwater irrigation system, had free healthcare, which is something that you haven't managed in America, free education, which is something that you haven't managed in America, and that's free global education. Any Libyan citizen could study any subject in any country of their choice and the state would pay for it. They'd give an allowance to married couples, a housing allowance. Okay, there was monthly contributions made to married couples into their account by the state. Libya was literally a heaven on earth in terms of its human rights. It's that very, very high in terms of the human rights index. There was everything about its governorship said you didn't need to invade it. It was probably a nation that you should be sending people over to learn from it. But because your race, your people, yeah, these people that you're trying to act like are the most advanced people, these white males, let's be totally honest with you, Nick Fuentes, yeah, these people, these Western white males who are so superior, wanted the wealth that Libya was generating so much and had so much of a hatred for progress outside of their control. They went in there and they murdered the leader. They murdered a lot of his family. In Saddam Hussein's case, they murdered his entire family, but in this case, murdered most of his family. They massacred his entire city. They created a racial genocide deliberately, which reduced the black population from small, because the first genocide was done by Europeans, to almost non-existent. And you've reduced the nation to essentially a terrorist state now, when none of those benefits are available. And yet the only thing that has increased since then has been oil production. But obviously no Libyan is benefiting from that, only Western organizations. And you're going to turn around and you're going to say, well, that's because white people are so much, you know, we're so much smarter. We're so much. No, you're barbarians. You're violent barbarians. Okay? And I'm talking about specific sect of white people who actually committed this, but it was white people. Let's not white men. Let's be clear about that. You're barbarians who, when you want something, you're willing to kill anybody and everybody for it. That's what's happened in Libya. You took a stable nation where people were happy, you've plunged them into misery, and now more white people are rich as a result of this invasion. That's not high IQ, that's not meritocracy, that's barbarians. You are savages. You are the savage race. And that's a case study that you couldn't refute. I'd ask you to refute the fact that white people are barbarians based upon what's happened in Libya, based upon what's happened in Iraq, based upon what's happened in Syria, based upon what's happened in Afghanistan. You are barbarian savage race. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. I just wanted to kind of go through that. That's gone on way too long. I don't know how much I'm going to have to cut down this video, but I just wanted to kind of like touch on this discussion that Candace Owens had with Nick Fuentes. And basically, for me, this conversation is this kind of like the chickens coming home to roost. When you spend your whole life disparaging people, that's going to come back, especially your own people. It's going to come back to bite you in the arse in conversations like this, where you're trying to have a reasonable conversation with an individual and he has zero respect for you because you've had zero respect for your own people. So I just find it quite interesting. What do you think of this discussion? I know I rambled a lot, but put your comments in the let's have a discussion about some of these things that we talked about today. Peace.
If you knew what you were